across the nighttime. City wakes her sleepless eye. Hear her voice shake my window. Sweet seducing sighs. Get me out into the nighttime. Four walls won't hold me tonight. If this town is just an echo, then let me take a bite. If they say why, tell them that it's human nature. Why does he do me that way? If they say why, tell them that it's human nature. Why does he do me that way? Reaching out to touch a stranger. Electric eyes are everywhere. See that girl, she knows I'm watching. She likes the way I stare. If they say why, tell her that it's human nature. Why does he do me that way? If they say why, tell her that it's human nature. Why does he do it that way? I like living this way. I like loving this way. That way. That way. Looking out across the morning, the city's heart begins to beat. Reaching out, I touch his shoulder. I'm dreaming of the street. If they say why, tell them that it's human nature. Why does he do me that way? If they say he's giving him back, ooh, tell them why does he do me that way? If they say why, does he do me that way? If they say why, ooh, tell them why does he do me that way? If they say why, ooh, tell them does he do me that way? If they say he's giving it back, does he do me that way? I like living this way. What way?
This is who we were just listening to. Hello and welcome. I rather like that song. That's very fitting for today's topic. So what have I been researching since the last time I decided to harass my peeps on YouTube? Well, what do you think? I came across an article, a debate between Chomsky and Foucault. And I think it's probably like back in the 70s, I'm going to say. And I'm going to share it. It's amazing. And I've not seen this before. So, learning something new every day as I'm expanding my knowledge and my research. So I really liked the descriptions. There's some, you can go look these people up if you want to, but that's totally irrelevant to what the message is that's being said here. And sometimes people that aren't so good, more times than not, in fact, every time that someone is a really good person that understands human nature, human behaviors, or why we do the things we do, they happen to be really awful people in real life. And that is more often the case than not. So, as you could say, the devil knows an awful lot about human behaviors and why people do what they do. In fact, he knows more about it than God does at this point, unless they're one and the same, which we can gladly have discussions about. So, so that being aside, we've got two identical, if you ask me. It's just that both of them are looking at the same model in the middle of the art room, and they have a different view. Their easel is placed into different, and they're arguing over whether or not they're painting a shoulder or they're painting, a face. And so they're so close there, but it would have been great if they'd get up and walk around the room a minute. And so that's what the meaning of life does. It gives you the visual of the body that you're actually looking at. You're actually looking at the same. So if you do study this human generational cycles, you're going to hear that being discussed. And then if you study the idea of, so that's more of Foucault, Foucault. I was going to say that wrong. It's French. He's French. His is more kind of on an epochal look or a generational cycle that's, very spokes in a wheel. Whereas Chomsky is going to be looking at that from the perspective of developmental, nature kind of having its way with us. And what the meaning of life does is it pulls both of those things together, and you have the wheel that you're looking at, where like I've said, a baby, not every baby walks at 12 months, but most do around that time. We'll never know the day or the hour, if you will, because you can't really perfectly know the moment that a baby is going to take a first step. You have a good idea, you can gauge it, but how many people have stories where they turned their back for a split second, turn around, the baby's already walking? And so clearly we could be walking around with cameras all day long, we're going to miss things because it's going to happen in a twinkling of an eye so quick that parents completely overlook it. In fact, humans aren't even looking at the developmental stages of children because they're working. How are we supposed to have a better understanding of ourselves if we are not looking at ourselves? And so this complete disconnect from our humanity and human nature, I see both of these things playing out, one leading to another, both being equal to each other. So anyway, I'm going to start the debate here, and we can chat about it. And so if there's anything that's said, just throw a chat up, and we can pause and we can have discussion. If there's a grown-up that wants to come up and join me and wants to watch this with me, I'm way rad with that as well. So anyway, but I do find this to be worth sharing, and there are a few comments. When we get into about 40, it's about an hour, so you're gonna have to be bored. But about 49 minutes in, which I'll go and clip separately, I think after this, just kind of highlighting this little section that's talking about society as a whole. That's why I said the meaning of life is so beautifully represented between what these two men are saying. Because it's taking the micro and macro and molding it together, saying this is how this can make sense.
In the 17th century, when Galileo discovered that the Earth turned around the sun rather than the other way around, many people were in a state of great shock. They had thus far believed that humans were at the center of the cosmos, and around this idea they had built their whole belief system. Suddenly, this did not seem to be the case anymore. Foucault's theory can be clarified by pointing out that, in relation to culture, he takes a sort of Galileo-type standpoint. Since the time of Galileo, people have thought that when it came to culture and society, humans were at the center. After all, it is they who created these. Foucault denies this. It is not the subject that counts to culture, he argues, but the structure, the universal. Something that is in itself already understandable. If one realizes that the rules according to which mankind behaves, for the largest part, were already invented long before one was born, and the name of the inventor remains completely unknown to us. One can compare Foucault to Galileo, but from another perspective, one can also compare Chomsky to Galileo, because his work in the science of language, linguistics, has had a great revolutionary influence over the whole world. Chomsky has brought about a major transformation in the field of linguistics. Interestingly, Chomsky's theories point in the exact opposite direction as the theories of Foucault. Chomsky gives much more primacy to the subject. In confrontation.
Do you see what I mean by, even he says that it's as if they're on opposite ends. They're on opposite sides of the room looking at the same human body that's in there. And their views, seemingly different from each other, are actually identical. Hello, William. Good to see you.
Information in the field of linguistics. Interestingly, Chomsky's theories point in the exact opposite direction as the theories of Foucault. Chomsky gives much more primacy to the subject. In the confrontation between these two completely different thinkers, it is moreover good to remember that they work in very different fields. Foucault is a cultural researcher. Chomsky is a language researcher. In other words, Foucault's interest lies in the history of scientific language, while Chomsky's interest lies in the daily language we use.
And that's the division that I was discussing. So one is looking at it from they're all referring to the same laws that apply, but one is looking at it from this and one is looking at it from that. And one's looking at it from a very analytical view and the other one is looking at a very human view. And analytics don't have room for they don't allow for things, whereas human nature allows. So what I mean by that is when we are discussing like every 12-month-old baby, every year-old baby walks, but not necessarily, we don't know when. So Foucault is saying, every baby walks at 12 months. And if that's not the case, then it can't be right. And then, Chomsky's saying, but wait a minute, the environment or nature impacts, and we can't say that right there. So you have to put these two together and allow for the crossovers that happen.
It is interesting, and maybe also not coincidental, that the debate between these two thinkers only really gets exciting in the second half when they start discussing politics. Still, I believe it is good that this is preceded by a theoretical part. This is because, in any discussion about philosophy and society, what matters are not the political standpoints certain thinkers happen to take, but rather on the basis of which arguments they do so.
Het is misschien ook wel leuk dat deze discussie plaatsvond in de hal van het
It might be nice to note that this discussion took place in the auditorium of the Technical College of Eindhoven. A discussion between two philosophers, two researchers whose work is characterized by great precision, great detail, and also great clarity. Further, I thought it quite symbolic that it took place in a space with lots of glass. The inner and outer world blended together. During the broadcast, you could see the traffic outside passing by. Symbolic indeed, because the relationship between the inner and outer world is central to the first half of the fourth philosopher's debate about human nature and the ideal society.
Because the world rejected you, you created a
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the fourth debate of the International Philosophers Project. Tonight's debaters are Mr. Michel Foucault, of the Collège de France, and Mr. Noam Chomsky, of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Both philosophers have points in common and points of difference. Perhaps the best way to compare both philosophers is to look at them as mountain diggers working at the opposite sides of the same mountains with different tools, without knowing even if they are working in each other's direction. All learning concerning man, ranging from history to linguistics and psychology, are faced with the question whether in the last instance we are the product of all kinds of external factors, or if in spite of our differences, we have something we could call a common human nature by which we can call each other human beings. So my first question is to Mr. Chomsky, because you, Mr. Chomsky, employ often the concept of human nature, and even in this connection you are using terms like innate ideas and innate structures. Which arguments can you derive from linguistics in order to give such a central position to this notion of human nature?
Well, let me begin in a slightly technical way. A person who's interested in studying language is faced with a very definite empirical problem. He's faced with an organism, a mature, let's say adult speaker, who has somehow acquired an amazing range of abilities which enable him in particular to say what he means, to understand what people say to him, to do this in a fashion that I think it's proper to call highly creative. Now, the person who's acquired this intricate and highly articulated and organized collection of abilities, the collection of abilities that we call knowing a language, that person has been exposed to a certain experience. He has been presented in the course of his lifetime with a certain amount of data, of direct experience with the language. And we can investigate the data that's available to this person. And having done so, in principle, we're faced with a very clear and a reasonably clear and well delineated scientific problem, namely the problem of accounting for the gap between the really quite small quantity of data, small and rather degenerate quantity of data that's presented to the person, to the child, and the very highly articulated, highly systematic, profoundly organized resulting knowledge that he somehow derives from this data. Furthermore, even more remarkable, we notice that in a wide range of languages, in fact, all that have been studied seriously, there are remarkable limitations on the kinds of systems that emerge from the very different kinds of experience to which people are exposed. Well, there's only one possible explanation for, what one can say in a rather schematic fashion, for this remarkable phenomenon, namely the assumption that the individual himself contributes a good deal, an overwhelming part, in fact, of the general schematic structure and perhaps even of the specific content of the knowledge that he ultimately derives from this very scattered and limited experience. That is, to put it rather loosely, the child must begin with the knowledge, certainly not with the knowledge that he's hearing English or Dutch or French or something else, but he does start with the knowledge that he's hearing a human language of a very narrow and explicit type that permits a very small range of variation. And it's because he begins with that highly organized and very restrictive schematism that he's able to make the huge leap from scattered and degenerate data to highly organized knowledge. And I would claim then that this instinctive knowledge, if you like, this schematism that makes it possible to derive complex and intricate knowledge on the basis of very partial data, is one fundamental constituent of human nature. But then I assume that in other domains of human intelligence and other domains of human cognition and even behavior, something of the same sort must be true. Well, the collection of this mass of innate schematisms, innate organizing principles, which guides our social and intellectual and individual behavior, that's what I mean to refer to by the concept of human nature.
Okay, so I want to stop and kind of explain another of what he's saying there. So when the baby hears the sounds of the voice, it starts to trigger a chain reaction in the brain. And it happens at a certain developmental stage as the human baby is coming and learning, and all of these little wires. Imagine that the brain is basically empty, and everything that the baby learns creates this little root or this little thread, or, so instead of like roots going down into the ground, it's like they're coming up. The brain has all these tiny little pathways. And at certain ages, if everything's been going right, these pathways are long enough and strong enough to meet with another one, and a connection is made, and we understand speech. And then as long as that connection is maintained, so as long as someone continually talks to the baby, it holds tight, it solidifies in the brain, and it becomes a permanent connection. And if that doesn't take place, though, and there is no confirmation of that understanding in the brain, it never forms. And then that's why at certain stages in our child's development, it's too late to fix things after a certain point. So if you have a baby that's left in a crib and it's left there up until a certain point, you cannot fix what has been done. It's past the point of no return. And there's lots of sick studies where they've done this to children and caused lifelong, damage, emotional damage to them. All in the name of science. So don't let them fool you when they absolutely knew the outcome of generations of babies going to daycare centers. They knew this hundreds of years ago. They knew what they get as a society, because if you have one and you have 100, you have an infestation, you have a problem. So that's what we got there. And so what he's saying is that then connection that gets made in that moment where speech is understood, if it's nurtured and it's taken care of, it blooms into it's like a mini, I guess, kind of a big bang. That one connection now just goes boom, and all these little fibers shoot out of it and go searching for the next connections from somewhere else in the brain that also had a little and those wires, those fibers and hairs are reaching out. It's interesting to note that our adolescent years are what bring the folding of the brain. So the brain then starts to fold in on itself. This is where we start to get, so as the brain is growing, the learning is what makes it fold. And so then you reach your adolescence and you have this folding of the brain again. It's a very interesting process that happens. So there's a lot of physical changes that happen during these times as well that we don't know. So when we're talking about the in the cathedral where we have, a sudden interest in, in God reaching down to touch, man with their fingers, ET style. And all of a sudden everyone seems to notice the brain behind him. Do you think that's by mistake? No, the connection was put there. You're now at the place where this connection meets another connection. And you now see this relation that you didn't see before, despite the fact that you'd seen that picture a million times. I could call that the Mandela effect, except I know better. So let's look now at how Foucault answers this question of human nature.
Well, Mr. Foucault, if I'm thinking at your books like Histoire de la folie et Les mots et les choses, I got the impression that you are working on a completely different level and also just with an opposite aim, opposite goal. If I'm thinking about the word schematism in relation to human nature, then you are just trying to work out that there are several periods, several schematisms. What do you think about this?
Well, if you permit, I will answer in French because my English is so bad that I would be ashamed to answer in English.
It is true that I mistrust the notion of human nature a little, and for the following reason. I believe that the concepts or notions that a science can use, not all have the same degree of elaboration. Let's take the example of biology. Within the field of biology, there are concepts that are more or less well established, like the concept of a reflex. But there also exist peripheral notions which do not play an organizing role within science. They are not instruments of analysis, and they are not descriptive either. These notions simply serve to point out some problems, or rather, to point out certain fields in need of study.
Ou encore qui servent à indiquer des domaines d'objets à étudier. Prenez par exemple.
For instance, there exists a very important concept in the field of biology,
C'est tout simplement la notion de vie.
the concept of life.
Au XVIIe,
In the 17th and 18th centuries, the notion of life was hardly used when studying nature.
ne se servait pas du concept de vie. Il classait les
One
êtres
classified natural beings, whether living or non-living, in a vast hierarchical tableau.
La vie était un
Life was a concept they didn't use and didn't need.
Et puis, à la fin du XVIIIe
At the end of the 18th century, a number of problems arose.
comme par exemple les problèmes
For instance, in relation to the internal organization of these natural beings.
Ou bien encore,
Moreover,
avec les
thanks to the use of the microscope,
microscope, le microscope d'Annecy, on a vu
different sorts of phenomena and mechanisms that had been unclear in the past and could not have been perceived until then suddenly came to light.
dont le fonctionnement n'était pas encore clair. Les progrès de
The
la
developments in
chimie
chemistry have also highlighted certain problems in relation to the connections between chemical reactions and the physiological processes of organisms.
physiologique de l'organisme. Et voilà que tout un domaine
And that's how an entire field appeared, one that was completely new for biologists, one that is nowadays known as life.
Et la vie, c'était une notion
Life was a concept that served to point out new fields of study that science still had to discover.
que la science avait à parcourir. Bon, et
I would say, as a historian of science, that the concept of life was an epistemological indicator,
épistémologique,
an
un
index of the problems that still had to be uncovered. And I asked myself whether perhaps one could say the same thing about human nature.
nature humaine.
Foucault is therefore comparing.
Okay, so you see, he's looking at it from a real analytical perspective. And he's saying that at some point, you know, we didn't have an understanding. And then suddenly we go, oh, there's life and biology blooms, which is exactly what I was describing happening to those tiny hairs and, you know, strings that connect in the brain. So the connection is there. And then now he says, oh, we made that connection in the 16th century. And then look what came out of it. So of course it wasn't there yet because it hasn't been developed. Like Chomsky's saying is that we haven't had that moment of the language yet. And so you have the moment of the language and then boom, that opens and unlocks something new in the brain that causes more fibers to reach out, more understanding and this happens in the internal brain. And then this is also happening as a collective on the external brain, or the collective, if you will, whatever that is for you. And so your thoughts in the things that we think of in our own individual selves also is being sent to the ether, to the collective. And that's where we get these ideas where no matter where in the world, you know, we all have these very similar stories or very similar symbols. Now, these are two things that are happening simultaneously with each other. Because on one hand, I have something coded inside my DNA, as Foucault says. There's got to be a coding there somewhere. There's got to be something, right? There's got to be something that turns that switch on. But it's the nurturing or the nature side that decides where, you know, when and if. And so you have, no matter where on the world you are, every baby crawls. They all crawl. Unless there's something physically wrong with the baby, it crawls. It can't not crawl. There's no place on the planet that the babies don't crawl of some sort of crawling. This is an encoded a process that's put inside us that once we reach this particular stage, if nothing has stood in our way, we take that next leap and we begin to move on our hands and knees or scooching or however we're doing it. And then that leads to the steps. And this is going to be universal, no matter where you are. This always happens. Well, the same thing happens with symbolism. So on a conscious level, so we have the physical, Foucault, we have the physical saying that, this is going to happen. But at the same time, we also have a natural thing happening. We have the mind happening, the language or the recognition of symbols. So we all recognize a triangle as well. We all recognize a circle as a 0 as well. We all recognize these symbols. And whatever we do with these symbols after, it depends on what language where you're from. But you recognize the swirls and the scribbles, and these early symbols look like scribbles, don't they? Have you ever seen a toddler drawing on paper? Have you ever seen what a baby does? It's swirls and circles and misshapes and waves and scribbles and swirls. That's one of the very first things the baby does with a crayon, is start swirling it around. Swirl, swirl, swirl. Why is it the symbol for the Pizzagate? I don't know. This is what babies do. It's a swirling. It's a symbolism of knowing yourself in space and time. Something that is encoded in your DNA that you have no idea why you do it, but you just do. And everyone like you does. And you don't know why you said yes, but you just did. And so did everyone else like you. So there's this part of our collective we don't know, but we just do. And that's encoded in our DNA. And I find that to be really interesting in listening now. What is this? How many years later? I'm pretty sure this was in the 70s, just kind of basing it off of the attire. So, early mid 70s. And the things that they're saying, they didn't even have reference to what we have today. So you can listen to it with kind of, as if, you're Bill and Ted. What would they think now? What would they say now if they could go back over that conversation and look at it from the perspective of what we've learned since? I do not think that I have, but I will after this. So thank you for sharing that name. Okay, back to the video. This guy's going to do some commentating about the two doctors here, the two psychiatrists here, whatever they, and then they're going to go on to a little bit more of the question answer. And then it gets really juicy, like he said in the beginning, when they start talking about politics. And what I really loved about that is, look how long ago this was. And it's exactly, they predicted the future. It's beautiful.
In Chomsky's concept of human nature with the concept of life as used in biology and in the history of that science. He does this because he sees the concept of human nature more as an indication of a research program rather than as an indication of humanity's potential for achievement. For him, human nature acts as a scientific shopping list and nothing more. Chomsky is willing to accept this as long as it is clear that the fields of biology, physiology, and neurology still don't have the means to adequately describe human nature and humans' capacity for language. Quite early on in the debate, the moderator, Mr. Elders, finds it difficult to keep the interaction flowing between the two speakers. This is partly due to the different languages they speak, but most importantly due to the fact that Chomsky and Foucault inhabit such different worlds of thought, to the point in which their ideas easily slide past each other. We actually observe the curious phenomenon of two brains thinking simultaneously, where one picks up the last claim of the other in order to further elucidate it from his own system of thought. For Chomsky, the concept of creativity plays an important role, and the following part of the debate will be largely dedicated to this issue. For Chomsky, creativity is actually a characteristic of all human beings. Everybody uses it. People stuck in traffic who unexpectedly and on the spot have to think about what to do next. The educator who doesn't want to fall into a pattern of authoritarian behavior, and when confronted with a difficult pupil has to invent new behavior. But above all, this creativity applies to the child who learns a language and who curiously learns to produce new language. Foucault is opposed to this idea. He constantly emphasizes the so-called epistemological field in which human activity takes place.
Dit epistemologische veld,
This
oftewel
epistemological field, or episteme, is described as the totality of unconscious rules that manage the totality of all separated fields of knowledge.
gescheiden velden van kennis beheersen.
Foucault also talks of tableau, and also calls it system of elements, and in the debate the word grill is mentioned, bar or grid. Perhaps it's best to speak of a network within which everybody in a particular culture thinks, whether they want it or not. It is a certain set of rules to which everybody's thinking obeys, and with which people search for identity, coherency, and so forth. The system is not a creation of particular individuals. It decides the rules of the think and do habits we call culture, which every individual is subjected to. Such a system is not a thing or idea, but lies precisely in between these.
Of idee, maar het ligt precies tussen ding en idee in. En de geschiedenis
For Foucault, the history of thought is not to be associated with the history of ideas, or even the development of the mind, but rather it should be understood as discontinuous transformations, transitioning from one network to another.
Overgangen van het ene netwerk.
That is a totally different approach from that of Chomsky, for whom creativity plays a central role.
Bij wie die creativiteit in het centrum staat. En het is duidelijk dat we
At this point, we encounter Foucault's dethroning of the subject, as already illustrated with the example of Galileo.
in het begin reeds gesproken hebben.
The philosophy of Foucault is a philosophy in which the philosopher constantly disappears from sight.
Voortdurend uit het beeld verdwijnt.
One could say that, paradoxically, it is a philosophy without philosophers, an idea to be generalized because humans are, according to Foucault, greatly absent within their own culture.
De grote afwezige.
In this respect, Foucault's
Okay, so I want to kind of pause there and say a few things about what they're, so Foucault is looking kind of more generationally, and to me, that's what I'm hearing. So he's seeing a bigger picture, and that we're kind of bound by some laws that we don't know exist. And I absolutely agree with that. And when he says that people are not even present, right? That's my favorite quote out of this whole.
could say that, paradoxically, it is a philosophy without philosophers, an idea to be generalized because humans are, according to Foucault, greatly absent.
They're greatly absent within their own culture. Beautiful. Probably the best quote. I loved it. So that I do see a lot of people completely absent from their minds, their self, full disconnect, completely self-centered, with a heart of altruism. That's the scary thing that we've got. We've got a ton of people screaming and chanting and protesting and loving, and they're all saying peace, love, and they're spewing hate and discontent. And they're just completely absent. They have no idea what they're doing. I feel like Jesus, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They're children. They're just children acting like adults and failing just exactly as children are meant to do. You're supposed to fail. This is our test. What kind of an adult are you going to be? You have a certain set of rules that we have to abide by. Okay, math rules all things, and there is always an equation for everything. And what I hear both of them saying is that is the case. They both agree that we are run by specific coordinates. A specific program is running us. However, within that program, there are a million different tiny little variations, each one of us so unique that it can't be repeated, because it happens from every millisecond, from the air I breathe in this breath to the air I breathe in that breath, alters me in some way. It changes something about you. The amount of condensation in your lungs, the amount you exhale, depending on how many words you're saying in this sentence, all of these we don't think about all of these processes. A bug bite now interfering with your body's need to rest because you're scratching, and a hair in your nose. Any of these things, these are tiny little things, and this is what would be referred to as the butterfly effect. Stuff that you have no concept. We think that if I breathe here, it changes the way. That's for fairy tales. Okay, and in essence, that's true. But the truth is that everything you do affects you, your own little tiny universe, where all the germs live on, and you've got the body and a finger and a toe and all of these things. You're your own little universe. If I took all that stuff apart, and everything you do, everything that does with you affects and alters you, brand new every millisecond. It's like that right now, again, before I even finish the word, before the sound leaves my tongue, before the thought leaves my mind, I've altered myself in some way. And that's what I hear Chomsky really putting at, because what Chomsky's saying is that it's that imagination, it's that artistic ability to think like that makes our environment so interactive, if you will. So there's no way an AI could ever recreate that. It can't recreate everything. It's not going to be able to ever do that. Can't do that. And so, that's the amazingness of the human being. But we're mortal. So, we can be killed off and go extinct and be a memory of an age that was. Do you remember when we were Neanderthals? Do you remember when we were Homo sapiens? Do you remember when we were millennials? I think that's very interesting that they're using the millennial generation and saying that the Gen X, ironically, what an interesting name, the 13th generation, that we're the last of the humans. We are the last of the humans. And they're not even talking about it in terms of zombie apocalypse and stuff. They're saying that genetically, the Generation X marks the end of Homo sapiens as we've known them. Their DNA is now closed. That's all the data that we're going to gather from this process. And we are now starting a brand new species where it is so altered that intently that we can give them a new name, a new Homo genus. That's a truth. And I believe that. That makes so much sense, because the industrial age, well, that kind of did it, right? That marked the end. There were so many things done to our DNA during that time that these generations never stood a chance. They're coming after your children. You were once the children they came after. You've got to get ahead of them, not walk behind them. It's too late for our children. You got to start fighting for your great, great, great grandchildren. That's how many moves ahead on the chessboard they are. Our children are lost. They're teenagers. They're young children. They're young adults. They're trying to figure the world out. They want everything to be peachy keen. They feel invincible. They're not having any thoughts of the future outside, get laid, get dinner, right? That's it. How should we be leaving them responsible for anything? They can't even think for themselves, for crying out loud. They can barely do their own laundry. So expecting them to have these, stand up for our rights, it's laughable. They know that. The controllers know that. The man knows that. He was prepared. He knew it. He gave us the cycle of generations that gave me an overprotected, underprotected, overprotected, underprotected, overprotective, spoiled, self-indulgent teenagers who have everything at their fingertips, can get money on their own without any grown-ups involved in all kinds of ways. And so what do they owe to society? Their lives are fantastic, right? They don't give a crap. They don't leave the castle. That's what I am saying. Jesus walked around. Buddha walked around, right? Hare Krishna walked around. That's kind of the point. They left the kingdom. They left the castle. They walked around. And so anyway, that's my take there. And now back to the video. I hope you are enjoying this, as I am absolutely in love with. I feel like I found a little gem. So, and it's been there. I just happened to find it. So fabulous. Go Google algorithms. Go Google gods. You're rocking today.
Within their own culture.
grote afwezige.
In this respect, Foucault's strong and negative reaction towards the moderator who showed interest in private matters of his life.
Fel en afwijzend reageert wanneer de gespreksleider belangstelling begint te vertonen voor privéaspecten van zijn bestaan.
When Foucault debates, it is about everything except Foucault himself.
Dit dus ter introductie.
This is an introduction to the following quite detailed theoretical part of the debate, which seems to mainly focus on one question. To what extent is the individual able to discover something new, and if so, how should we make sense of this? This seems to me a very relevant question, especially if we remind ourselves that we need quite some new forms of behavior, knowledge, and science if we want to survive together in this world.
Willen we het er in onze wereld met elkaar levend afbrengen?
We resume the debate where Foucault explains why he doesn't pay much attention to the creativity of the individual from a historical perspective. Within the traditional history of science, the creativity of individuals has been accorded maximum importance. The history of science, up until recently, essentially consisted of showing how an individual, whether it was Newton or Mendel, had been the creator, or rather the discoverer, of a reality that was already existing in things and in the world. A reality that no other person had previously discovered. I believe the postulate that lies at the core of the traditional history of science is that truth exists in order to be known, yet the human mind, due to the effect of a number of inhibitions or obstacles, has not managed to see this truth. The mind is made to see the truth, and a contingent obstacle is impeding him to see it. According to some historians, this obstacle could be linked to socioeconomic conditions, or to different forms of mentality, or to a belief and naivety in the old religious myths and moral themes. All of these could act as obstacles, as blinders to those who want to see the truth. In reality, the mind is meant to see. It is made to have access to the truth. In this traditional conception of the history of science, on the one hand, there is an emphasis on the creativity of the individual, who has the right to possess the truth, and yet a system of obstacles will prevent him from capturing, formulating, and constructing this truth, to which he is essentially entitled to possess. I believe the problem that is being posed is the exact opposite. What happens when we witness a great scientific transformation? In the great scientific transformation, for instance, the birth of biology, mid-17th century, or the birth of philology at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, it is true that a number of obstacles, prejudices, preconceived ideas tumble and disappear. What strikes me, however, is that science, at the moment of its birth, not only gets rid of a certain number of obstacles, but also eliminates and masks a certain amount of existing knowledge. It's as if applying a new grid which allows for the appearance of phenomena that had been previously masked, while at the same time masking already existing knowledge. Therefore, a science, the advancement of science and the acquisition of science is not simply the oblivion of old prejudices or the fall of certain obstacles. It is a new grid that masks certain things while allowing for the appearance of new knowledge. Therefore, when I criticize the notion of creativity, what I mean is that truth is not acquired through a kind of continuous and cumulative creation, but rather through a set of grids stacked on top of one another, which leak old and collect new knowledge.
I think in part we're slightly talking in.
Okay, I liked that explanation that he gave there. What I hear some of in when he was talking there was the cycles of the generations, where you've got the artistic generation that comes after the crisis, this cycle that happens there, and as if that part of the human condition where we express ourselves artistically at times when we can't express ourselves verbally, which, is an artistic generation seems to come, right after the crisis, while they're still trying to put the pieces back together. And so, there's this kind, there's still this tension, that whether it be racism or whether it be, discontent to the government. So you have this hushing generation where, if their parent was the one that was speaking out and now is in the gallows, they got to go along. They're next. So, it's a time where, the secrets get encoded. And the thing about a creative mind is that a creative mind allows me to encode my secrets in everything I do. And no one may ever be able to crack the code, but someone might, if you had the ability to make enough pieces, and maybe, some rich guy likes your shit, art in itself being a very selfish act, not in a bad way. I don't mean it in a bad way. Not all selfish acts are bad, but it's a consuming of my thoughts slammed onto a piece of paper or slammed onto some type of, it's a vomit. It's a beautiful thing, I think, but it always comes after the illness, it metaphorically and literally. And so that's the part that I think Foucault is not he's not allowing for that to be necessary to the cycle that he's referring to. And so, you have to allow for a baby, and a child has to have an imagination. Mankind has to have, that has to be part. I think it's, shoot. Well, it doesn't matter. The archetypes, I can't think of whoever's name. Hey, Toffee, there's, our 12 unique archetypes. There's another book that I want to read after this, 4 Agreements, that talks about the fracturing of the psyche, and what we are, the family within, I think is the name of it even. And it refers to that family that you have inside you. And generational cycles go. So a nomad gives birth. So a rebel gives birth to an artist, and an artist gives birth to a rebel. And the hero gives birth to the prophet, and the prophet gives birth to the hero. And the fall and the spring and the summer and the winter. And you have this, north, south, east, west, 4, archetypes that stem from. And in us is an artist. If you're not an artist, say you go, but I can't draw or I can't paint. You're not artistic. You can barely even dance. There's nothing you do that's artistic. Okay. You do though, because you think. That's, and the problem is, do you think for yourself or do you let other people think for you? So you can be creative with your thoughts. And that's why I like to allow open thought, because open thought gives me the ability to think of anything I want without anybody going, that's not right. I never said that was right. I said, I'm thinking about it. And the truth is that if I think about it, someone else has thought about it. There is nothing new under the sun. They have a theory, the Jesus theory or whatever, that basically says there were lots of Jesuses. There were lots of Newtons. There were lots of Einsteins. They were all over the planet. There were lots of greats, but only one wins the ultimate prize of, Miss Universe. So I can't be alone in thinking that I'm alone in my thoughts. And if I think of something, someone else has thought of it. And the really sick part, somebody's done it. So there isn't anything that you can't think of that's already been done. Clearly, we've reached that point because our Hollywood is absolutely horrible right now. There's nothing at all coming out good. I'm watching it and I'm like, I have seen this before. It was called something else, and in many cases, it was called the same thing, which is a bizarre thing. But it's not really, because the behavior of human beings during their 12-year-old years or their middle years is in fact to just report on something they've read. They're to learn it, they report about it. I learn it, I tell you about it. They're not allowed to have creative thought anymore. So when we sit and we look back at our ancestors and we think that we understand what they mean by these cave drawings or these stories that sound, about fish, come on, people living in Wales, come on. So we have to look at that from the perspective of a baby. We have to give it its proper placement in time and space. And we have to say that it is absolutely imperative, if that's the word I'm thinking of. It's necessary to the formula that you allow free thought, because without free thought, you have nothing. Nothing exists. So I think, therefore I am. I am, therefore I think not. Because now that I'm here, I'm not thinking. I'm thinking this. I'm making new things. I'm not thinking, don't think this. I can't not think this. I'm trapped by the laws that are set in front of me. As Foucault says, I'm bound by certain things. Then Chomsky says that you have to be able to have free flow thought of ideas, that's necessary to the process. And so I really enjoyed these two sides, and how, listening to these just really made me start thinking about how I see the world, how I perceive the world, where I came, barreling in the classroom, and then I go, fuck, I have notes on this. I just called it something different. It's more like a confirmation of concepts that this ability to look in a different direction than where the arm is pointing, avoiding the magic, avoiding the trick they're lying down in front of you, where they say, no, you can only think like this. You must only rinse, wash, repeat. You must learn it, and then you must give a book report on it. And you're going to call yourself a vlogger, and you're going to collect money for t-shirts, and you're going to have thousands of followers because you're cute. And that's the society we're going to live in. So just keep regurgitating. Be creative in other ways. You can crochet, you can paint. And we're already standing right at the threshold of another artistic generation, which they predicted was going to happen. I don't know, right now, for fuck's sakes. We're here. Kids expressing themselves through their artistic work without an understanding of what to express. In other words, they don't even know who to be mad at. They don't know who to draw in their art. They're only drawing their own reflections right now. Are you a scary? Are you a scary, or are you a happy? What are you drawing? Where do your animes look like? What are your, it's just nuts. And it's so predictable, which is the word of the day. My goodness, we're easy. Okay, back to welcome all the couple new people that have come. I think there's like 10 now watching. So apparently it's not as boring as I was assuming it was going to be. So I'm going to let them continue. Now Chomsky is going to come in with his, because what he was saying earlier is that Foucault doesn't like any of his he's got some personal life, and I think that it was going in that direction, and he kind of did a 180, and I didn't necessarily catch it in the video, and of course I'm sure it was probably more of a private thing. I only learned this as I was kind of getting some more information on these two, and so I'm not sure if that's even what it's alluding to, but that's kind of what this. So to me, when I was watching it, it felt out of place, is all I'm saying. So now they go back.
Cross purposes because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic.
Is not simply the oblivion of old prejudices or the fall of certain obstacles, It is a new grid that masks certain things while allowing for the appearance of new knowledge. Therefore, when I criticize the notion of creativity, what I mean is that truth is not acquired through a kind of continuous and cumulative creation, but rather through a set of grids stacked on top of one another, which leak old and collect new knowledge.
I think in part we're slightly talking in cross purposes because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic, and therefore the onus falls on me, not on you in this case. But when I speak of creativity, I'm not attributing to the concept the notion of value that is normal when we speak of creativity. That is, when you speak of scientific creativity, you're speaking properly of the achievements of a Newton. But in the context in which I've been speaking about creativity, it's a normal human event. I'm speaking of the kind of creativity that any child demonstrates when he is able to come to grips with a new situation, describe it properly, react to it properly, tell us something about it, think about it in a new fashion for him, and so on. These are, I think it's appropriate to call those creative acts, but of course without thinking of those acts as being the acts of a Newton. It's the lower levels of creativity that I've been speaking of. Now, as far as what you say about the history of science is concerned, I think that's correct and illuminating, and particularly relevant, in fact, to the kinds of enterprise that I see lying before us in psychology and linguistics and the philosophy of mind. That is, I think there are certain topics that have been, what was your word, depressed or put aside during the scientific advances of the, say, past 2 centuries, century and a half. But now I think we can overcome those, or it's possible to put aside those limitations and forgettings and to bring into our consideration precisely the topics that animated a good deal of the thinking and speculation of the 17th and 18th century, and to incorporate it within a much broader and I think deeper science of man that will give fuller role, though certainly not will not hope to give complete understanding to such notions as innovation and creativity and freedom and production of new new elements of thought and behavior within some system of rule and schematism. Those are concepts that I think we can come to grips with.
In reality, I believe there is a quite strong similarity between what Mr. Chomsky said and what I have tried to show. In other words, there exist, in fact, only possible creations, possible innovations. One can only, in terms of language or of knowledge, produce something new by putting into play a certain number of rules which will define the acceptability or grammaticality of these statements, or which will define, in the case of knowledge, the scientific character of the statements. Thus, we can roughly say that linguists before Mr. Chomsky mainly insisted on the rules of construction of statements, and less on the innovation represented by every new statement, or the hearing of a new statement. And in the history of science or in the history of thought, we placed more emphasis on individual creation, and we had kept aside and left in the shadows these communal general rules which obscurely manifest themselves through every scientific discovery, every scientific invention, and even every philosophical innovation. These are not only linguistic rules, but also epistemological rules, which characterize contemporary knowledge.
Perhaps I can try to react to those comments within my own framework in a way which maybe will shed some light on this. How is it that we're able to construct any kind of scientific theory at all? How is it that given a small amount of data, it's possible for various scientists, for various geniuses even over a long period of time, to arrive at some kind of a theory, at least in some cases, that is more or less profound and more or less empirically adequate? This is a remarkable fact. And in fact, if it were not the case that these scientists, including the geniuses, had, if they didn't have built into their minds somehow, obviously unconscious specification of what is a possible scientific theory, then this inductive leap would certainly be quite impossible. Just as if each child did not have built into his mind the concept of human language in a very natural way, in a very narrowing way, then the inductive leap from data to knowledge of a language would be impossible. So even though the process of, let's say, deriving knowledge of physics from data is far more complex, far more difficult for us, for organisms such as us, far more drawn out in time, requires intervention of genius and so on and so forth, nevertheless, in a certain sense, the achievement of discovering physical science, or biology, or whatever you like, is based on something rather similar to the achievement of the normal child in discovering the structure of his language. That is, it must be achieved on the basis of an initial limitation, an initial restriction on the class of possible theories. And the fact that science converges and progresses, that itself shows us that such initial limitations and structures exist. That is, I don't think that scientific progress is simply a matter of accumulative addition of new knowledge and absorption of new theories and so on. Rather, I think it has this sort of jagged pattern that you described, forgetting certain problems and leaping to new theories and so on and so forth.
And transforming the same knowledge.
But I think that the explanation.
So what I hear when he's describing that, when we talk about losing knowledge, so just laughingly, we lost the technology to go to the moon. Did we? Okay. Right. So, but we have these times in our antiquity where we seemingly lose a lot. We have these setbacks, right? Some are mass extinctions. Most of them happen in a 100-year cycle of some type of war. And these cycles have been going on forever, right? And sometimes the cycle's real close together and it doesn't take 100 years between them. And sometimes it's, it is. And so the, I forgot, I lost my train of thought for a minute. Oh man, that's a bummer, Budgie. Budgie says he's bored with theories. I like people's theories. Then it makes me think. I have to think. What was I talking about? I can't even remember now. I'll remember in a minute, I'm sure. So, I'm only human, right? I think they were talking about the
for that. So I think one can perhaps hazard an explanation for that fact. And oversimplifying grossly, I really don't mean what I'm not going to say literally. It's as if, as human beings, a particular biologically given organism, we have in our heads, to start with, a certain set of possible intellectual structures, possible sciences. Okay? Now, in the lucky event that some aspect of reality happens to have the character of one of these structures in our mind, then we have a science. And it's because of this limitation, initial limitation in our minds to a certain kind of possible science, it's precisely that provides the tremendous richness and creativity of scientific knowledge. That is, if it were not, it's important to stress that. This has to do with your point about limitation and freedom. If it were not for these limitations, we would not have the creative act of going from a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, to a rich and highly articulated and complicated.
That's right, I remember now. With the knowledge that we have that disappears on us. And I think it's real interesting going along with that 13, going along with the symbols that are there for the invisible, the fear of not being seen, being rejected, alienated, the fear that we're heading into, Violet being invisible in The Incredibles. That's her superpower. Why? Because she's an adolescent and that's how you feel invisible. So these these ideas with the missing, the kind of invisibleness, the floor you can't see, Friday the 13th, the darkness. We have a lot of that out and in the open. And when we're talking about, the Freemasons and hidden knowledge and unlocking Jesus's secrets, and you're not reading the Bible right, and did you know, and an old ancient text, and in this religion they believe that, and over here in this tribe they believe that, and we found some cave paintings, and I mean, who knows what the hell I have. When we're just collecting, destroying, changing, I don't know, we're those aliens. This is where I think that kind of step back happens. And we gather a lot of things and then something interferes. We have a war. We have a some type of altercation, and all of what we put together is stolen. So now let's put that in sci-fi terms. So in antiquity, you know, I'm a king and I blow down your castle and I steal all your books from the library and all your, you know, your peeps that are smart, and I bring them over here and I start NASA. And now they're my peeps. And then somebody comes over and beats me up, steals my peeps, steals my books. That's how they played. I mean, that's kind of the rules of the game, is it not? So when something just pops out of the blue or found in someone's basement private collection, I don't, get the fuck out of here. You think I would believe anything that's come out? Do you think? I've watched enough Crown Affairs. I know the art is already fake. Half of it's fake already. You don't even have the real Mona Lisa. You ain't never had the real Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa's been gone. It's been gone for a very long time. You know, it makes me think how much of that is really there, and along with that creative, artistic archetype that lies locked inside of us, waiting for us to have a grandkid, and it gets unlocked again, because that's the way the circle goes, right? So I'm a rebel. My mom's an artist. My grandpa's a rebel, and my great grandpa's an artist. That's how the cycle works. I can go back in time many generations and probably find that same pattern playing out for a while. We're as consistently put into these two positions, reincarnated back into the same nomadic bullshit through my great granddaughter. Fuck. I'm pissed off again. I was born pissed off. I'm going to stay pissed off. You know? No, nobody's an 8. Hello, X and Z. My caveman brain has a theory. Too many rabbit precedes too many foxes. It's an interesting statement. Do I think we have? Well, I was saying that earlier in the stream, or maybe in the stream before this one. I can't remember when I was saying. I don't know if it is, but the odds are. So mathematically, yes, it's fake. It's always been a fake. But I don't know that. I mean, I can't give you some article I've read. That's just a hunch. And if it's not the Mona Lisa, then it's a Picasso somewhere. There's very few. And how would you even know? That's the thing. You could tell me all day long it's an original, but how would you know? You wouldn't. Because I was saying that when we're babies, we see our mother as ourselves. So therefore, the first outside entity besides ourselves is our father. And that's why humanity chose father first. In reality, mother was first. It's just like which came first, the chicken or the egg. They came together. The baby sees itself with the mother, sees itself as one together. And then when the father is understood as a third party, from the baby's perspective, there's two. It's not for another couple of months before it starts the separation anxiety from mother that it actually has that understanding. Mother is separate from me, therefore making her second in the mind of the child. And that's why we have that order. It has nothing to do with anything. It has to do with the way that the child perceives the world when it comes into it. And the mother is already present. He doesn't recognize her till she's third. She's secondary. And then the baby is third. So after the baby recognizes its mother is separate from self, that's when it actually has a recognition of it being separate from self. And that's where you have babies being very interested in mirrors, and why they're often on those little things where the baby's lying down and scooching so that they can look at themselves. That's the age of mom separation, where we start becoming mobile and we begin to crawl and scooch and move around, and we see ourselves as a separate being from mom. She's over there. I'm over here. Well, that's okay. I'm okay. Look, there's another baby in the room, you know. And I don't know why that is absolutely one of the most beautiful stories. And yet that isn't how we view it. We say women are less than, God created them last. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out of here. It would always be woman. That's the Venus. Just find that Venus being the first. I was just looking in again. I have old notes, but I didn't know where they are. And I fell back down the astrology hole. Comparing, as I was doing the other day on my stream, or I'm comparing, you know, the apostles with the Torah, with the astrology, with the horses, the 4 horsemen, and the, you know, earth signs, and your seasons, and your big corporations for shits and giggles. But just really to show that there's so many layers, like, you know, Foucault is saying, it's a grid on top of a grid on top of a grid on top of a grid. And this information that we gather while we're all having a good time before the crisis comes, it gets lost in that grid after the war is over. It falls into the hands of what other king wanted. And that's going to happen again. And the easiest way to do it, if I was the bad guy, is to just, I don't know, turn off the electricity or the internet with something I can blame on the sun, you know, and it's a solar flare, you know, right? But really, it's not. It's not a volcano. It's not a fire, a wildfire. Get the fuck. They're going to blame it on the rain, and it's going to be fake. It's going to be, you know, a fake Mother Nature, where those guys were actually pretty good singers. They were masked and used. And that's how we can view what's going to happen to Mother Nature. She's going to get blamed, as every mother does, for her child acting out. There you go. That's a good way to look at it. Okay, I'm going to go back to, let me see where I'm at in the minutes. Yes, okay, so I'm going to go back to here, and right here, so right as I'm going to just go back to the science right at minute, where this guy's really looks cute across from me in my chair. It's like we're both thinking at each other, my avatar and him. Do you see it? That was kind of fun. I was like, oh, look, hey, we're thinking. And then that girl over there, she's like, this is interesting as fuck. I've got to hear, I've got to see. I don't want to miss this. Or is that a dude? I think that's actually a dude now that I see the shirt and the vest. I'm thinking. Okay. So here's where it's going to start really getting interesting about politics, and really be able to start seeing what they're discussing when it comes to the attitudes of today. So this is why I thought this was fun sharing, because if you've hung around here, you know I love generations, so you at least are fluent in Generations 101, because that's kind of just our niche. And so you're going to be able to really hear something different than probably everyone who's ever heard this before. And because now you're going to have reference, because this is the 70s, and here we are in 2023 or something like that. And in that time, 50 years, listen to what he's saying. Again, just another really beautiful, and it is, isn't it? He's very nice with the, he has a wedding ring, I think, on it. I think that's a class ring. If that had been a class ring, with the watch, beautiful. But he's got the furrowed brow. He seems like he is not, I always called that my Botox wrinkle, because it's literally the largest wrinkle on my whole fucking face, my whole body. It's the wrinkle that shows up when I go, what the fuck? You know the one? You know that one. That's the what the fuck wrinkle. That's your Botox wrinkle. That's the one some of us just go, ah. Anybody that sees my face will go, that girl goes, what the fuck? A lot. Her face has stuck like that. Just like her mom said, you're going to make that face at me. That is the face I made at my mother. What? Are you kidding me? Have you lost your mind? Just say these things and you'll feel it. You'll see it in the mirror. You'll know exactly which wrinkle I'm talking about. Raise your hand if you have one. Okay, let's go back to our party here. Things are about to get personal.
Important to stress that this has to do with your point about limitation and freedom. If it were not for these limitations, we would not have the creative act of going from a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, to a rich and highly articulated and complicated array of knowledge. It's precisely because of that that the progress of science, I think, has the erratic and jagged and transformational character that you describe. And that doesn't mean that everything is ultimately going to fall within the domain of science. Quite the contrary. Personally, I believe that many of the things we would like to understand, and maybe the things we would most like to understand, such as the nature of man or the nature of a decent society or lots of other things, might really fall be outside the scope of possible human sciences.
Well, I think we have now two questions out of this statement. One question is, if you can agree, Mr. Foucault, do you agree with the statement about a combination of limitation, fundamental limitation?
Not a combination.
It's not a matter of combination. Creativity only becomes possible thanks to a system of rules. It's not a mixture of order and freedom. Freedom can only be exercised thanks to a system of regularity. Where perhaps I don't completely agree with Mr. Chomsky is when he places these regularities within the sphere of the human mind or human nature. I would like to know whether one cannot discover the system of regularity and of constraint which makes science possible somewhere else, even outside the human mind. In social forms, in relations of production, in class struggles, etc. But what does this theory of knowledge mean for your theme of the death of man, or the end of the period of the 19th and 20th centuries? But this is not related to what we are talking about. I don't know, because I was trying to apply what you have said in relation to your anthropological concept. You've already refused to speak about your own creativity and freedom, haven't you? Well, I'm wondering, what are the psychological reasons for this? Well, you can wonder about it, but I can't help that. But what are the objective reasons in relation to your perception of understanding, of knowledge, of science, for refusing to answer these personal questions? Does it have to do with your conception of society? When there is a problem for you to answer, what are your reasons for making a problem out of a personal question? No, I'm not making a problem out of a personal question. I make a personal question an absence of a problem. In the entire tradition of the history of thought, ideas, and sciences, one has always questioned the problem of knowing. At what age was Newton weaned into conceiving the universal law of gravity? At what period did Cuvier meet his first mistress in order to finally discover fossils and comparative anatomy, etc.? I believe these types of analyses, which I'm now simplifying, are not very interesting. On the other hand, it is much more interesting to understand the transformation of a certain knowledge within the general field of science and within the so-called vertical field, which consists of a society, a culture, a civilization at a particular moment in time. Once we finally grasp the totality of this transformation, we realize that the little individual moments of a wise man's life are not important. Again, Foucault's last comment suggests how the individual life of the researcher tends to disappear from sight. But how do we explain then the relation of man in relation to its culture in politics, and maybe even the question about how to change this culture and society? After all, one can show within the history of science and culture, the input of the individual is almost negligible. The question, how do I act, the political question, remains standing. It may thus be clear by now that this political question, from Foucault's perspective, rapidly develops into how far can mankind escape from its own culture? It is important to note that Foucault doesn't want to distance himself from politics. On the contrary, He says, I would have to be ideologically blind to not interest myself for that which is most substantial to human existence, economic relations, power relations, you name it. Therefore, Chomsky and Foucault do agree on the importance of the political question. In his opinion, it is required to abolish and destroy the different forms of capitalism in order to favor direct workers' participation. It may also be informative to explicitly mention that Chomsky defines his political standpoint as anarcho-syndicalism in workers' councils and so on. Decentralization, socialization, and participation are key words in Chomsky's political program. Chomsky might say he sees no obvious relation between his scientific and political views, but the following opening statement reveals that he heads straight from his scientific conceptions to politics. His political and scientific views may not flow logically one from the other. They do certainly head in the same direction.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge that I think is intrinsic to human nature will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
I would say that I'm much less advanced than Mr. Chomsky in this respect. That is, I admit not being able to define, not even to propose, an ideal social model for the functioning of our scientific or technological society.
Fonctionnement social idéal pour notre société scientifique ou technologique. En revanche, une des tâches.
On the other hand, one of the tasks that seems immediate and urgent to me, over and above anything else, is this. It is the custom, at least in our European society, to consider that power is localized in the hands of government, and that it is exercised through a certain number of particular institutions, such as the administration, the police, or the army. One knows that all these institutions are made to transmit and apply orders, and to punish those who don't obey. But I believe that political power also exercises itself through the mediation of a certain number of institutions that look as if they have nothing in common with political power and as if they are independent from it, but in fact are not. One knows the university, and more generally all teaching systems, which appear to disseminate knowledge, are made to maintain a certain social class in power, and to exclude the instruments of power of another social class. Another example is psychiatry, which in appearance is also intended for the good of humanity and for the knowledge of psychiatrists, but in reality is another way to bring to bear the political power over a social class. Justice is yet again another example. It seems to me that the real political task in our contemporary society is to criticize the workings of institutions, particularly the ones that appear to be neutral and independent, and to attack them in such a way that the political violence which has always exercised itself obscurely through them will finally be unmasked so that one can fight against them. If we seek to advance straight away a profile or a formula of the future of society without having thoroughly criticized relations between the different forms of political violence that exercise their power within our society, we run the risk of letting them be reproduced, even in the case of the noble and apparently pure forms, such as anarcho-syndicalism.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, not only in theory, but also in action. That is, there are two intellectual tasks. One and the one which I was discussing, to try to create the vision of a future just society. Another task is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression and terror and destruction in our own society. And that certainly includes the institutions you mentioned, as well as the central institutions of any industrial society, namely the economic, commercial, and financial institutions. In particular, in the coming period, the great multinational corporations, which are not very far from us physically tonight. Those are the basic institutions of oppression and coercion and autocratic rule that appear to be neutral. After all, they say, well, we're subject to the democracy of the marketplace. Still, I think it would be a great shame to lose or to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical, if you like, task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics, and relates that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized, in which meaningful human life could take place. And in fact, if we are thinking of social transformation or social revolution, though it would be absurd, of course, to try to draw out in detail the point that we're hoping to reach, still we should know something about where we think we're going. And such a theory may tell it to us.
Yes, but then isn't there a danger here? If you say that a certain human nature exists, that this human nature has not been given the rights and possibilities that allow it to realize itself in our contemporary society, that's really what you have said, I believe. And if one admits this, doesn't one risk defining this human nature, which is at the same time ideal and real, and has been hidden and repressed until now, in terms borrowed from our society, from our civilization, from our culture? I will give an example by greatly simplifying it. Marxism, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, admitted that in capitalist societies, man hadn't reached its full potential for development and self-realization. That human nature was effectively alienated in the capitalist system. And Marxism ultimately dreamed of a liberated human nature. On the other hand, what model did it use to conceive, project, and eventually realize that human nature? It was, in fact, the bourgeois model. Marxism considered that a happy society was a society that gave room, for example, to a sexuality of a bourgeois type, to a family of a bourgeois type, to a bourgeois type of aesthetic. And it is, moreover, very true that this has happened in the Soviet Union. A kind of society, simultaneously real and utopic, had been reconstituted and transposed from the bourgeois society of the 19th century, in which humans finally were able to realize their true nature. The result, that you also realized, I think, is that it is difficult to conceive of what human nature precisely is. Isn't there a risk that we will be led into error? Mao Zedong spoke of bourgeois human nature and proletarian human nature, and he considers that they are not the same thing.
Well, you see, I think that
Okay, I'm sorry. I hit the wrong button. I was trying to pause it. I like how Foucault is talking about I am going to go back a minute. The human nature. I like that I can see what he's saying at the bottom. Using the Marxism and what that
admitted that in capitalist societies, man hadn't reached its full potential for development and self-realization.
Right. So when we were talking earlier here, we were saying how the brain it has a moment where this becomes realized. That's the hidden knowledge. The hidden knowledge is that you just haven't realized it yet. You haven't learned to the point where that connection can be made. So it's like trying to teach, a first grader calculus. You're not going to be able to do that unless that first grader grows up and starts, learns all of the steps, and then calculus is easy peasy lemon squeezy. And hey, Arkash, And so a society that hasn't realized itself yet is acting in its current state of nature, its current understanding. A 3-year-old is acting the way a 3-year-old is going to act based off of its environment. And so in capitalist societies, where I've been saying on other streams that we've been delayed, we've been stunted, man hasn't reached its full potential for development of its self-realization. So here we are as a collective in our 13th birthday, supposedly realizing who we are, and we have no clue because of the societies, the environment that is around us, which is where all of that creativity comes from, as you know, Chomsky puts it. So so when I'm listening to that part there, that's what I'm hearing him describe, how the big business has used this guy's work and that guy's work and the generational theory guy's work and Freud's work and Piaget. They've used all of their work and they've literally created a generation that's going to be, you know, our heroes. They've manufactured a hero for the masses in the age of Aquarius, and that hero is not who you think. That's your proverbial Antichrist, because when I'm an adolescent, I have a come to myself moment, an actualization where I feel invincible. I feel like I could rule the world, right? I just defeated Goliath. I defeated the big guy on the school. I said no to my parents. Nothing can stop me. I'm invincible. I faced death. I faced the beast. That's why in our tribal rituals, they have to go out at 13 and come back with the pelt of a wolf or a bear or something, you know, or they have to do some type of rite of passage ritual into the next 6 years of their adulthood. They have to show that they're worthy. And we get that in religion, you know, show you're worthy to be saved. And even in spirituality, they say, you know, you've got to put in the time, you've got to do your yoga and eat your smoothies. You've got to prove that you're worthy. So I know it's there because I have these words. It's something that parents say to their children, you know, when they're wanting a reward. You need to be worthy of this reward. Have you earned it? Have you been plowing the fields? Have you been cleaning your room? Have you been doing your homework? Are you worthy of this, you know, McDonald's cheeseburger or whatever, Happy Meal? Are you worthy of the Happy Meal? And so it's in everything we do. And it develops into a social score. Gossip. Are you worthy? You know, it becomes the next thing in the mind of the human. It becomes the next stage of focused thoughts. It becomes the next obsession. By Calvin Klein, your CC. I'm going to go back here and just go ahead and play this part again because I really love what he's saying. And I don't want you to have forgotten what he said because you were listening to me kind of throw my thoughts in here of what I hear when I'm listening to them, what I hear from based off of what I've been learning, not a regurgitation of what they're saying. Anybody can do that. I'm telling you, this is my research has said, and when I'm listening to them, I'm seeing this in my own research. I'm going, holy fuck, I got that. I got notes on that. I've got notes on that behavior. Okay.
And such a theory may tell it to us.
Yes, but then isn't there a danger here? If you say that a certain human nature exists, that this human nature has not been given the rights and possibilities that allow it to realize itself in our contemporary society, that's really what you have said, I believe. And if one admits this, doesn't one risk defining this human nature, which is at the same time ideal and real, and has been hidden and repressed until now, in terms borrowed from our society, from our civilization, from our culture. I will give an example by greatly simplifying it. Marxism, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, admitted that in capitalist societies, man hadn't reached its full potential for development and self-realization. That human nature was effectively alienated in the capitalist system. And Marxism ultimately dreamed of a liberated human nature. On the other hand, what model did it use to conceive, project, and eventually realize that human nature? It was, in fact, the bourgeois model. Marxism considered that a happy society was a society that gave room, for example, to a sexuality of a bourgeois type, to a family of a bourgeois type, to a bourgeois type of aesthetic. And it is, moreover, very true that this has happened in the Soviet Union. A kind of society, simultaneously real and utopic, had been reconstituted and transposed from the bourgeois society of the 19th century, in which humans finally were able to realize their true nature. The result, that you also realized, I think, is that it is difficult to conceive of what human nature precisely is. Isn't there a risk that we will be led into error? Mao Zedong spoke of bourgeois human nature and proletarian human nature, and he considers that they are not the same thing.
Well, you see, I think that in the intellectual domain of political action, that is, the domain of trying to construct a vision of a just and free society on the basis of some notion of human nature, in that domain we face the very same problem that we face in immediate political action. For example, to be quite concrete, a lot of my own activity really has to do with the Vietnam War, and a good deal of my own energy goes into civil disobedience. Well, civil disobedience in the United States is an action undertaken in the face of considerable uncertainties about its effects. For example, it threatens the social order in ways which, let's say, one might argue, bring on fascism. That would be very bad for America, for Vietnam, for Holland, and for everyone else. So there's a danger, that is one danger in undertaking this concrete act. On the other hand, there's a great danger in not undertaking it. Namely, if you don't undertake it, the society of Indochina will be torn to shreds by American power. And in the face of those uncertainties, one has to choose a course of action. Well, similarly, in the intellectual domain, one is faced with the uncertainties that you correctly pose. Our concept of human nature is certainly limited, partial, socially conditioned, constrained by our own character defects and the limitations of the intellectual culture in which we exist. Yet at the same time, it's of critical importance that we have some direction, that we know what impossible goals we're trying to achieve if we hope to achieve some of the possible goals. And that means that we have to be bold enough to speculate and create social theories on the basis of partial knowledge while remaining very open to the strong possibility, in fact, overwhelming probability, that at least in some respects we're very far off the mark.
Well, perhaps it is interesting to go on a little bit further on this problem of strategy. So, for example, in the case of Holland, we had something like a population census. You were obliged to fill in your papers and so on, you know. So this you would call, if you are not filling in your papers, civil disobedience.
Right. Now, I would be a little careful about that because going back to some very important point that Mr. Foucault made, one does not necessarily allow the state to define what is legal. Now, the state has the power to enforce a certain concept of what is legal, but power doesn't imply justice or correctness even. So the state may define something as civil disobedience and may be wrong in doing so. For example, in the United States, the state defines it as civil disobedience to, let's say, derail an ammunition train that's going to Vietnam. And the state is wrong in defining that as civil disobedience because it's legal and proper and should be done. It's proper to carry out actions that will prevent the criminal acts of the state, just as it's proper to violate a traffic ordinance in order to prevent a murder. If I was standing at a street corner and the traffic light were red, let's say I was standing in my car and I drove across the traffic light to prevent somebody from, let's say, machine gunning a group of people, of course that's not violation of law. It's an appropriate and proper action. No sane judge would convict you for such an action. Similarly, a good deal of what the state authorities define as civil disobedience is not really civil disobedience. In fact, it's legal, in fact, obligatory behavior in violation of the commands of the state, which may or may not be legal commands. So one has to be rather careful about calling things illegal, I think.
Yes, but I would like to ask you a question. When in the United States you commit an illegal act,
I regard as illegal, not just the state.
No, when the states, an action
state
is not
regards-
When the state considers it illegal,
illegal.
Yeah.
Est-ce que vous faites
do you justify your action in terms of justice of an ideal,
en vertu d'une justice idéale, ou bien est-ce
or do you justify it in terms of necessary class struggle?
que la rend utile et nécessaire?
Well,
Est-ce que vous vous référez à une justice idéale? Voilà
again,
le problème.
very often when I do something which the state regards as illegal, I regard it as legal
Yes, that's
because I regard the state as criminal.
Alors,
But in some instances, that's not true. That is, let me be quite concrete about it and move from the area of class war to imperialist war, where the situation is somewhat clearer and easier. Take international law, a very weak instrument as we know, but nevertheless it incorporates some rather interesting principles. Well, international law in many respects is the instrument of the powerful. That is, international law permits much too wide a range of international forceful intervention in support of existing power structures that define themselves as states and against the interests of masses of people who happen to be organized in opposition to states. But in fact, international law is not solely of that kind. And in fact, there are interesting elements of international law, let's say embedded in the United Nations Charter, which permit, in fact, I believe, require the citizen to act against his own state in ways that the state will falsely regard as criminal. But nevertheless, he's acting legally, because international law also happens to prohibit the threat or use of force in international affairs, except under some very narrow circumstances, of which, for example, the war in Vietnam is not one, which means that in the particular case of, let's say, the Vietnam War, the one that interests me most, the American state is acting in a criminal capacity, and people have the right to stop criminals from murdering people. Just because the criminal happens to call your action illegal when you try to stop him, that doesn't mean it is illegal. I mean, a perfectly clear case of that is the present case of the Pentagon Papers in the United States, which I suppose you know about. Reduced to its essentials and forgetting legalisms, what is happening is that the state is trying to prosecute people for exposing its crimes. That's what it amounts to.
c'est donc au nom
So it is in the name of a purer justice that you criticize the functioning of justice.
de la justice. Parce que, c'était pour moi, si vous voulez,
It is important for me to know about this.
nous avons actuellement en France un débat
In France, there is currently a debate about the problem of justice and that of popular judicial institution.
populaire à propos de la justice. Vous connaissez le problème. Et un certain nombre
A certain number of people, including Sartre,
pensent que pour
believe that in order to make a critique of the current penal system or of police practices,
ou pour faire la critique de des
we have to
pratiques
create a kind of tribunal
que la police se conduit, il faut faire une
which,
sorte
in the name of a superior, ideal, and human justice, will condemn the practices of the French judges or policemen.
humaine en général condamnera la pratique des juges français ou des policiers français. Et puis il y a
Moreover, there is another group of people, myself included, who say this shouldn't be done because
non.
when they refer to an ideal justice, which the tribunal is supposed to apply, they refer to a certain number of judicial ideas
Vous vous référez
which were formed in our time by a certain number of individuals who are themselves, directly or indirectly, a product of their societies.
d'une façon directe ou indirecte les produits de la société dans laquelle nous nous trouvons. Il faut
We have to attack the practices of justice.
il faut attaquer la police,
We have to attack the police and their practices,
mais en termes de guerre,
but in terms of war and not in terms of
You
justice.
believe that your role in the war is a just role, that you're fighting a just war, to bring in a concept from another domain. And that, I think, is important. If you thought that you were fighting an unjust war, you couldn't follow that line of reasoning. And I would like to slightly reformulate what you said. It doesn't seem to me that the difference is between legality and ideal justice. It's rather between legality and better justice. Now, this better system may have its defects, certainly will. But comparing the better system with the existing system, and not being confused into thinking that our better system is the ideal system, we can then argue, I think, as follows, that the concept of legality and the concept of justice are not identical. They're not entirely distinct either. Insofar as legality incorporates justice in this notion, in this sense of better justice, referring to a better society, then we should follow and obey the law, and force the state to obey the law, and force the great corporations to obey the law, and force the police to obey the law, if we have the power to do so. Of course, if in those areas where the legal system happens to represent not better justice, but rather the techniques of oppression that have been codified in a particular autocratic system, well, then a reasonable human being should disregard and oppose them, at least in principle. He may not, for some reason, do it in fact.
je voulais simplement
I would simply like to reply to your first sentence.
vous avez dit
When you said that if you didn't consider the war you wage against the police to be just, you wouldn't wage it. I would like to reply to you in terms of Spinoza and tell you that the proletariat doesn't wage war against the ruling class because it considers such a war to be just. The proletariat wages war against the ruling class because it wants, for the first time in history, to take power, and because of its will to overthrow power, it considers such a war to be just.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
One wages war to win, not because it's just.
I don't personally agree with that. For example, if I could convince myself that attainment of power by the proletariat would lead to a terroristic police state in which freedom and dignity and decent human relations would be destroyed, then I wouldn't want the proletariat to take power. In fact, the only reason for wanting any such thing, I believe, is because one thinks, rightly or wrongly, that some fundamental human values will be achieved by that transfer of power.
Alors, je vous répondrai ceci. Quand le prolétariat prendra le pouvoir,
When the proletariat takes power, it may be quite possible that the proletariat will exert towards the classes over which it has just triumphed a violent, dictatorial, and even bloody power.
violent, dictatorial et même sanglant. Je ne vois pas quelle objection.
I can't see what objection one could make to this.
Vous me direz, et si le prolétariat...
But if you ask me what would be the case if the proletariat exerted bloody, tyrannical, and unjust power towards itself,
Alors je vous répondrai, ça ne peut se produire.
then I would say that this could only occur if the proletariat hadn't really taken power,
Mais c'est que une classe,
but that a class outside the proletariat, a group of people inside the proletariat, a bureaucracy or petit bourgeois elements had taken power.
Well, I'm not at all satisfied with that theory of revolution for a lot of reasons, historical and other. But even if one were to accept it for the sake of argument, still that theory is maintaining that it is proper for the proletariat to take power and exercise it in a violent and bloody and unjust fashion, because it is claimed, in my opinion falsely, that will lead to a more just society in which the state will wither away, in which the proletariat will be a universal class, and so on and so forth. If it weren't for that further justification, the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat, violent and bloody, would certainly be unjust. At least I, for example, am not a committed pacifist. That is, I would not hold that it is under all imaginable circumstances wrong to use violence, even though use of violence is in some sense unjust. I believe that one has to estimate relative injustices. But the use of violence and the creation of some degree of injustice can only itself be justified on the basis of the claim and the assessment, which always ought to be undertaken very, very seriously and with a good deal of skepticism, that this violence is being exercised because a more just result is going to be achieved. If it does not have that grounding, it really is totally immoral, in my opinion.
Je ne suis pas sûr
As far as the aim of the proletariat in leading a class struggle is concerned,
que se propose le prolétariat en menant la guerre de classe,
I don't think it would be sufficient to say that it is in itself a greater justice.
que c'est une plus grande justice. Ce que le prolétariat,
What the proletariat will achieve by expelling the ruling class and by taking power
et en prenant pour lui le
is
pouvoir,
precisely the suppression of class power in general.
le pouvoir de classe en général.
Okay,
Car le
that's the
prolétariat,
further justification.
Eh?
That is the further justification.
That is the justification, but one doesn't speak in terms of justice, but in terms of power.
Justice. It's because the end that will be achieved, it is claimed, is a just end. If no Leninist or whatever you like would dare to say we have a right to take power, let's say we, the proletariat, and then throw everyone else into crematoria, let's say. I mean, if that were the consequence of the proletariat taking power, of course it would not be appropriate. The idea is, and for reasons I mentioned, I'm skeptical about it, that a period of violent dictatorship, perhaps violent and bloody dictatorship, is justified because that will mean the submergence and termination of class oppression, a proper end to achieve in human life.
mais il me semble que de toute façon,
But it seems to me that in any case, the notion of justice itself functions within a society of classes as a claim and as a justification for it made by the oppressed class.
comme justification du côté de la classe oppressive.
I don't agree with that.
Et dans une
And in a classless society,
classe, je ne suis pas sûr que
I'm not sure that we would still use this notion of justice.
justice.
Well, here I really disagree. I think that there is a sort of an absolute basis. If you press me too hard, I'll be in trouble because I can't sketch it out. But some sort of an absolute basis ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. And I think that our existing systems of justice, I think it's too hasty to characterize our existing systems of justice as merely systems of class oppression. I don't think that they are that. I think that they embody systems of class oppression, and they embody elements of other kinds of oppression. But they also embody a kind of a groping towards the true humanly valuable concept of justice and decency and love and kindness and sympathy and so on, which I think are real.
Well, do I have time to answer? Yes. How much? Because 2 minutes? But I would say that that is unjust.
Absolutely.
No, but I don't want to answer in so little time. I will simply say that I can't help but to think that the concepts of human nature, of kindness, of justice, of human essence and its actualization, all of these are notions and concepts that have been created within our civilization, our knowledge system, and our form of philosophy. And that as a result, they form part of our class system. And one can't, however regrettable it may be, put forward these concepts to describe or justify a fight which should and shall in principle overthrow the very fundaments of our society. This is an extrapolation for which I can't find the historical justification.
Well, I think we can start immediately the discussion.
Okay, so that one seemed to get the chat a little excited. The debate where I hear that is, so forget what situation they're talking about. Where in our human nature is it okay to rebel? Who decides the rules of the game, and who decides when I'm not going to play by those rules and I make my own rules? And this is where we get that ping pong that keeps happening back and forth, where, you know, that pyramid fulcrum in the middle of this teeter-totter, the balance that is the Libra scales, is constantly up and down, you know, like a frequency, black, white, up, down, on, off. You know, it's an opposite. And so it's going, and that pyramid just sits, that fulcrum just sits right there, is sucking no matter which side is up and which side is down. They're always in the center. There's no change for them. They never lose, nor do they win. They've got themselves. That's that top 10% of your Freemason pyramid. That's what that means. Those people are not affected by anything that's happening. They're in their own little bubble. It doesn't affect them. They've set themselves up for perfect balance, right? And so we're busy out here playing the game with the ones in the pyramid, playing us. So, we're buying the insurance, and we're buying the cars that need the insurance, and the house that needs the insurance, and we don't want to die, so we got to get some insurance. And are you sure? Are you insured? Are you sure? I'm insured. And so that tip has become filed down. It's so sharp that, they can just blow on one side and it causes an effect. The other goes down, the Dow Jones down, and it crashes, and nothing changes for them. They're never. So how far out on that, how far out are you? Are you getting picked off? Are you in the outside circle of the sheep? Do you get picked off by the wolf because you're on the outside? Are you sick or lame or something? Better get some insurance for that. You're way out there, so that when that teeter-totter flips, you feel it. It's very abrupt for you. You ever been on a teeter-totter and your friend got off and your ass hits the ground and you get a jolt up your spine, an electric shock to the system, and for a second you're like, what the fuck? I think I'm dying. And that is what happens to a lot of people. It's a drastic shift in their reality, because one minute they were nice and warm inside the center, And then the next day they're on the outside. What are you talking about? It's cold out here. And there's things in the woods and they're looking at me. Let me back in. Let me back in. And so this is what is happening with society as far as I'm concerned. And so when do you make the rebellion? You know, how long do you sit back and plan? How many more bars are you going to let them put on your cell before you're not going to be able to fit through anymore? You know, it started out, it was a big door. It was a whole wall was empty. You could just move around the space. And then somebody put up a wall. And then you were like, fuck, there's a wall there. I can't go that way. And you got to go around the wall. So they put up another wall. And you're, fuck, I got to go around another wall. And that's what a maze is. And you're going around the maze. And there's just wall after wall after wall. And then after a while, you wander around so much that now the walls are so tall, you can't even jump over them now. You can't even see the flag that marks the center. They're so high. And so, you know, like towers in the city, feeling like you're in a maze. You ever been in a city and just looked up and been like, oh my God, I'm in the middle of like the maze. I'm in a maze with their grid-like roads and their high tower, you know, towering buildings. See, I saw, exactly. I see, I saw, I see, I saw. And I'm here and I'm there. I saw. I have an eyesore from seeing. So when we're sitting here on the cusp of another revolution, a revelation in the sense that we're recognizing that we're coming into ourselves, our spiritual awakening is happening, everyone. You're hitting puberty. Oh my God, you're in puberty. And these are the things that are going to happen to you. You're going to feel awkward about things. You're not going to really know what's going on with yourself. You're going to feel like a stranger in your own body. You're going to feel invincible. Invincible. And you're going to also feel invisible. Some of you are going to have, you know, negative thoughts. And some of you are going to have positive thoughts. And some of you are going to have, you know, Britney Spears and Justin Bieber thoughts where you guys are going to do security rings or sobriety rings or whatever the fuck they're called. Oh, yeah. You know, and, you know, you're going to abstain from things. And some of you are going to say no to that ridiculousness and you're going to skip school altogether. And that's where I kind of think the 13 is relevant here, that the invisible, you know, the true teachings of Jesus, you know, being a 12-year-old. He's a 13-year-old now. He's popping in. He's 12. He's got all his shit together. Because at 12, when you're in 5th grade, you feel like you know a lot. And then you hit puberty and you don't know fucking shit. That's why you have to do your rites of passages. These are very important to move into the next stage of your development. If you haven't figured out yet how to defeat your own bully, you're forever going to be stuffed in a locker. And so what are you going to do now? I find these very interesting, you know, trains of thought. Because I'm sitting here watching these things. Exactly. Playing a game of normal chess, and the game has changed. That's not the game anymore. I'm having Brittany's very good. And that's very normal of you, Budgie. The sexual revolution that we're sitting in is a normal human experience. And as a species, that's our job. I think we can skip school. So on a much higher level, exiting the matrix, how the fuck do you get out of here? What's the 13th step? You know, what's the Jacob's ladder? You have to be aware of what it is to be human on both good and bad. You have to learn where your boundaries lie. One of the things that's interesting about Foucault is that in his private life, he has a bit of a problem, and, whatever. And yet Jordan Peterson will tell you, what he's saying is on point. So forget that he's an asshole. Forget that he's a really bad person. Okay. And he does things that he should not be doing. The fact is that he understands something about human nature, and he's worth considering, when doing research. And the thing that we forget about these moments is that and this is Freemasonry, knowing your limitations. Literally the worst people on the world, the worst human beings on the planet that you can think of. Okay. Those people know more about the human condition than anyone else. They know why you do what you do. They know why you're going to do what you do. And they're prepared, and they're there with a buffet waiting to take you to the promised land. They're prepared for your rebellion. They already know that you're going to sneak out of your room. So they're going to put bars on your room. In fact, they knew you were going to sneak out of your room before you were born. So they made sure those bars were there from day one, so that you never even thought about it. They gave them, because if I'm 13 and all of a sudden bars show up on my windows, I'd be like, what the fuck? But if those bars had been there my whole life, I'd never question their existence. I'd never think about whether or not they were keeping me safe as far as I was concerned, because the boogeyman lived out there and I had bars in my window. And when that leaf on the tree would tap my window and I'd look out, I'd have a sense of those bars are there. They can't come in. Can break the glass, but it can't come get me. And a false sense of safety, when in reality, the monster's in your own house. Those bars are on the outside. The glass is on the inside. That way you can shatter the glass, but you can't go nowhere. And you can't even unscrew them. See, if they really wanted to keep burglars out, they would have put the bars on the inside of the windows so that the burglars can't unscrew them. Fuck, I'd never thought of it that way. Jesus Christ. Well, what are we really doing? So our parents were prepared. They were absolutely prepared. And consumerism and the age of the 3 generations that we've been in, this industrial age, that's exactly what we have. We have a whole 3 generations of children now at play who are in their childhood. We have another generation in their young adult. And then the millennials, they're in their middle age. They're coming of age into their middle age. We're moving into our elderhood. So these generations, ironically named XYZ, and then A for alpha, as if we're starting the snake again. I mean, come on. They don't pick these things for no reason. Everyone who knows Freemasonry knows, or gematria knows, or, language knows, that they code within codes, within words, and within titles and signals and whatever the fuck, their logos for their businesses. Anyone who's a self-proclaimed truther knows that to at least some degree, that the checkerboard exists. So what's wrong with taking that and bringing out your microscope a little bit further, just a little bit more? Let's imagine that they're prepared. They were parents that before you were born, they read Dr. Spock. And Dr. Spock prepared them for the rebellion of their 13-year-old children. And they are prepared. So they bought a house in a safe gated community with a home, with a security system and bars and cameras on you at all times. And you've never thought anything of it because you have loving, caring parents who play with you on TikTok videos and buy you numerous amounts of shit from Amazon and let you have whatever you want. And it's all, and don't do what the teacher doesn't tell you what to do. You don't even have to listen to the teacher. And they're going to be giving us, computers anyway for teachers. You're gone, teachers. Fuck you. That's what you get for not babying and powdering the baby's bottoms when you had them in your class. That's what you get for not allowing them to be pampered. Really, we had an entire generation, the MEings, who are children copying what it's like to be a parent. And I'm going to use this example. When I was in school and that generation that was the Gen X, and this is just a unique piece of history about, schools and how we're taught and the fuckery that goes on in the mind frames if you like these types of connections. So we have the one thing about the Generation X that I find really fascinating to really look at as a cohort, which as a cohort, as if it is the golden child. Because really, Gen X represents an almost textbook example of a teenage behavior within a teenage archetype. It lines up that you not only have a group of individuals that as a cohort are rebellious, coming of age during a war or a tension-filled sweet spot of the last time we saw this, it was 1776. You know what I'm saying? It hasn't happened. It was almost okay. So I'm somebody who studies something and in the universe and since the beginning of us studying the stars, we've never been able to catch one of these stars in action. And the Gen X represents a moment where in psychology, you can grab a snapshot in the moment of that action playing out live and in person when you're actually documenting it and watching it develop. And so these are not coincidences, the way that they have been coming at the generations. They are literally gathering data on the human condition, because at this moment we are acting out the very cosmic laws that are at play on our development as a collective. And that gives a really good idea of how predictable we're about to be. And they have everything in motion by overindulging us. So we have a generation that's already underprotected and overindulged. What? Let me show you how that happens. So it appears as if we have a generation of children. So let's call them TikTokers. Okay, the Zers, really. And they're zapping. They're putting a big a zero. They're going to amount to fucking nothing. That's what they're going to equal. That's why they get a Z. And there are children, the Xers, the rebelliers. You're out. And we took your kids with us. Fuck off. Anyway, that's what I'm telling you they're doing. And I can see it. So we have this prophetic generation that over protects their children. So this is where we're going to get the millennials. So they're prophet baby boomer parents, overprotected them. Gen X is an underprotected latchkey generation. The millennials are an overprotected, overindulged generation, which equals kids that don't leave your house and kids that need to, go to classes at the university called MEing classes or millennial classes, adulting classes is what I think they were titled. And it's because they never had a parent that was home to emulate. Because after school, they, went to, programs and they went to ball games. They're the era of the soccer moms and do you get what I'm saying? They're the godchild and they're a hero generation. Well, now the next thing that happens is that they you have another generation that's underprotected. So what's that? That's the artistic generation, or the Zers. And what did the Zers get? Way underprotected. And under the guise of protection. That's what was the magic trick that was performed there. Because when we're being overprotected by being involved in lots of things and having a parent that's active, and so they think that they're protecting you from all evils in the world by putting you on stage, but in reality they are massively underprotecting you. You're getting whammied by the same two behaviors in one generation all at once. So it makes it even harder for that generation now to make a choice. And so they're riding the fence, if you will. And that's clearly been done. And overprotecting by wanting to save their lives, by wanting to vaccinate them or protect them from the boogeyman, and at the same time allowing them to participate in things that are horrible for them. There's new home learning. You don't go to school now, learn virtually, and we'll give you the glasses. So your kid, and they show a little 6-year-old girl or a little 7-year-old boy, and they're putting on their little virtual reality glasses, and they're in the classroom, and they're calling this virtual classroom or something. It's the newest thing. Sign your kids up. It's so bizarre. And yet, the writing's on the wall. I can see it. And they've been doing it for so long now that it's invisible to you. And I think that's part of what this argument that they were having, this debate, is about. What do you define as a choice when you have specific laws and boundaries and environments and so many different things going on that affect you, but at your core you're predictable. And I think that's the coming into know thyself, is recognizing that you're not predictable, in that you can think for yourself, and you can be creative again, and you can start changing what we're seeing, and you can start saying no and drawing lines and defining your identity of where you are in this thing called life. Are you ready to get off at the 13th floor, the rapture zone, and say no? Or are you ready to go on with the next 10 commandments, where you will not disobey God or face the wrath? And it's God that makes those choices, or whoever's underground bunker you're living in. Nuts. That's a very good reference. Alone in a crib. And don't we know what happens to those kids? Complete disconnect. Cha-ching. 666 or 777. Lucky you. That's me. I'm getting off. 777. I'm not 12. I'm 14 now. Bitch, I'm slipping out. I'm not going into 9th grade. I'm not interested in upper school or university. And for whatever that is, my upper being says, we're going to skip out of here. How about we skip school? We go grab a veggie burger and, a blunt. And we hit the road, Jack. These kinds of things. Okay, so please share out my streams if you think that the things I say are somewhat interesting. I want more people willing to come talk to me. So if you are, fudge sickles. Hang on, I forgot to put my email in here. So I made a new ticker. Did I put it? No. Here it goes. Okay. And, we just have to email and then, schedule something, and then that's on the schedule, and we can have a chat. I did enjoy listening to these guys, and I appreciate the amount of people that were actually in here. Thank you very much, because that really shocked me. And so it encourages me to keep talking about these things. Although I do want to have fun, so invite me, to your place. And, I can't always, I do get in these moods, but I do also like to have fun too, and just kind of chatter. But I love open thought discussions. So anybody that wants to come up and bounce things back and forth and share knowledge, challenge what I'm saying, or ask questions, or come up and say, oh my God, every time you say this, it makes me think of this. And so I wanted to share what you make me think of. Tell me what I make you think of. And the comments, people leave comments. I appreciate those. And I do try to interact there. So is everyone having a good evening? Is there other things going on? I'm looking for a kiwi. Oh my gosh, I love kiwis. Is it a bird or the fruit? Both are fabulous. And teeter totter, a seesaw. Here's a joke. There's a joke that says in America, so this will be fun for all of my European friends or my foreign friends or whatever the politically incorrect thing to say is. You find the worst way to say my friends. Okay, there's a joke that says, what did Tennessee? The same thing Arkansas. There you go. So there's some state to state humor for you. Yuck, yuck. There's like 6 people here. I see Rich is here. Robert's active in the chat. Ulick's been active in the chat now. And our X and Z is here. It's caramel flavored. Your kiwi is caramel flavored. States humor. Yeah. Little States humor. I'm sure you guys probably have very similar puns in your own places of origin. That would be a fun thing to compare, like what puns you have from your place. I don't know. Anyway, okay, I'm going to end this because I do, think that that's an interesting conversation, something to think about. It kind of adds to some of the thoughts I have about, how I think this works, and the meaning of life theory that I'm now calling it, hashtagging it. So if you, know others, you can come and let's talk about things. So we'll bounce out. Remember the excellent comment to leave. A special thank you to your Jesus Bible Creation Devil discussions, because it's all encompassing, and who knows, I might be back again in 15 minutes, as I move on to the next, just so you can see the things, that my playlists include, this is my playlists. Can I zoom in there? I just go everywhere. I'm just all over the place. Why Frank Zappa? Why are you afraid, that your chakras and the whole, this has been you can see the ones I've watched, and then ones I have, let's see, your green eye slit aliens is just your mojo augmented. Yeah. So, I just go, and whatever inspires me. And then I talk about it. I also have to read another book tonight, another chapter from our book tonight. So stay tuned for that. And remember, No contact is the road to freedom. Be a no person. Rebel against the system. Get off on the 13th floor. Give Freddy Krueger a great big kiss.
This public service announcement is brought to you by Rotten Studios. Remember, no contact is the road to freedom.